Welcome to our daily devotion here from Second Comber. I wonder if you remember way back when television was black and white. Well, if you do, then, like me, you're beginning to show your age, I say, with a wry smile. Last week I was on the internet and I picked up some black and white footage which led me down a nostalgic alleyway. Do you remember professional wrestling on a Saturday afternoon? Which, although was first televised way back in 1955, it was to reach its zenith in popularity with the world of sport in the mid-60s. And perhaps you also remember some of those household names associated with that sport at the time. Mick McManus, Jackie Pallo, Giant Haystacks, and Big Daddy, to name but a few. And yes, for sure, for a short period, wrestling became a sporting mainstay in the Saturday afternoon television audiences. But what about yourself? Have you ever wrestled? Well, maybe not in the way I've just mentioned, but think about it, especially if you're struggling in some way. And if so, I ask you three questions. What is it that you really need from God right now? What blessing do you want from Him? And how badly do you want it? I'll just say that again. What is it that you really need from God right now? What blessing do you want from Him? And how badly do you want it? You know, there are times when God only releases His blessings on us after a season of prolonged or even painful wrestling with Him. And as such, in that vein, I would like to mention one of the strangest wrestling matches in history. It's way back in Genesis 32, and here we find a man named Jacob. He is on his way home to Canaan with a small tribe, including his wives and children, after a 20-year sojourn in the region of Padan Aram. And he is scared to death because his estranged brother Esau is coming to meet him with 400 men, Genesis 32, verse 6. You see, there is historically issues between the two brothers, and this is no welcome party. In fact, it is an army. So after splitting his household into two camps to try and avoid complete annihilation, Jacob is understandably suffering insomnia. And this night before he is to meet his brother, Jacob intends to spend the night alone, no doubt in some type of desperate prayer. But during his lonely night-long vigil, a strange man shows up in the darkness and wrestles Jacob until daybreak, and this rudely interrupts his plans. At some point during this weird contest, Jacob realizes that he is actually wrestling with God. And by daybreak, God decides it's time to end the match, and he dislocates Jacob's hip and demands to be released. And with this, Jacob, in significant pain, replies, "I will not let you go until you bless me." And this response clearly pleases God, who pronounces His blessing on Jacob. He says, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob," which means deceiver, but Israel, which means striving with God. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Therefore, as the day begins, Jacob limps towards his tense reunion with Esau, with a weakened body, but with a strengthened faith. Having wrestled with God, he knows his prayers regarding Esau will be answered. Indeed, there are blessings through wrestling with God. We should take note of what God did when He wrestled Jacob. Jacob began that night dreading Esau's arrival. He was full of fear and desperation. But he ended a night of struggle with God's blessing and a renewed faith. In fact, all of our wrestlings with God in faith lead to peace. And isn't it interesting that God on this occasion did not simply speak to Jacob in a dream or vision as he had at other times past, and thereby reiterating his promise and speak comforting words. But this time, God addresses Jacob's fear by requiring him to wrestle all night. This no doubt probably felt to Jacob all of a badly timed hassle, when all he wanted was just comfort and assurance. But later he realized just how comforting it was. See, sometimes when we want God's comfort, he sends it in unexpected or even unwanted packages. If necessary, God will cause us to limp to increase our faith. I know that God even afflicted Jacob with a debilitating injury. This had the effect of making Jacob even more vulnerable to Esau, and therefore it forced Jacob's faith to rest more fully on God and not upon himself. And if necessary, God will cause us to limp to increase our faith. And lastly, wrestling with God changed Jacob's identity. He was no longer to be known as the one who received his blessing by deception. This time he received God's blessing by prevailing with God in faith. The struggle turned out to be a profoundly gracious gift of restoration that God gives Jacob. Not unlike the gift Jesus gave to Peter by letting Peter affirm his love for Jesus as many times as he had denied it. John 21, verses 15 to 17. Jacob's tenacious faith pleased God, and he rewarded Jacob's request. When God calls us to wrestle with him, there's always more going on than we perhaps first understand. And God will always use this to transform us for good. Yet sometimes it's hard for us to understand that God wants to bless us. For when God makes us wrestle with him for some blessing, it is not because God is reluctant to bless us, even if that's how it feels at first. It is because he has more blessings for us in the wrestling than without it. Remember, it was God who pursued Jacob for this match. God was the initiator. The story starts with Jacob stewing in his own anxieties over Esau and his approaching murder squad, and then God showed up. And it was in the wrestling that drew Jacob out of his fearful preoccupation that forced him to focus on God. I doubt that Jacob wanted this forced focus or even believed that he needed it at first. I wouldn't be surprised if at the beginning Jacob had prayed, God, would you get rid of this guy? This is the last thing I need right now. But what he was to discover was that the wrestling was a means of God's grace, a channel for God's blessing upon him. And the same is true for us even today. So I ask you again, what do you really need from God right now? What blessings do you want from him? And how badly do you want them? Do not let God go until he blesses you. So remember, Jacob. Remember, there are multiple blessings in the wrestling. You may not need soft words of comfort. You may not need to be left alone with your thoughts. You may not need even sleep or even a healthy hip. What you do need is God's blessing. And so it is God's blessing I leave with you today. Goodbye.